Welcome to another episode of Clinic Success Secrets, the podcast where we uncover the strategies and insights that drive clinic growth and elevate patient care. I'm your host, Tommaso Dwyer, founder of Clinic Success Partners, a medical digital marketing agency dedicated to helping clinics serve more patients and achieve the success that they deserve. Today, I am honored and genuinely excited to welcome Max Marchione, co-founder and COO of, and I know it's been said before, possibly the coolest website domain that you're going to hear for a long time, which is superpower.com, a groundbreaking healthcare platform focused on disease prevention and enhancing human capabilities. Max really, again, big advocate of pushing the boat, thinking big, and not just trying to iterate on something that potentially might be broken in the first place. So with a rich background in venture capital and a passion for health optimization, Max really is reshaping the future of healthcare. His work at Superpower and previous ventures demonstrates a commitment to innovation in healthcare, investment in unique ideas and outlooks in life that often go unnoticed. Max, I just want to say, great to have you here.
That's a very kind intro, man. I'm excited to be here.
So for anyone listening, superpower.com, check it out. It's probably one of the coolest websites you'll see in a while as well. But before we talk about that, would you mind telling us a bit about your background? I know you've been in tech since you're like 12 years old. Tell us a bit about that journey.
Oh gosh, 12 years old. You really went back. I'm presuming what you're referring to is I used to play a lot of Minecraft, and on a large server of 20,000 people, me and my little brother became the richest players on the server, and then used the localized status to create our own server and monetize that. So I guess that's technology. I think it was more like understanding people and arbitrage and psychology and business. But that is really interesting because I think gaming worlds are like microcosms of the real world in many ways, right? There's commerce, there's human interaction, there's business, there's an entire economy. And I think that I probably learned far more from doing that than many of the other things I've done. And the irony is the conventional dogma is, no, you don't learn shit all from doing things like gaming. I grew up in Australia. I first became obsessed with healthcare really around the age of, between the age of, I guess, 12 and 18. I was going through a long period of misdiagnosis. It would take me several hours to get to sleep every night. I had no idea what was wrong with me. I saw dozens of different doctors. Was told to medicate for life, and no one could solve it. So I tried to solve it myself, and that meant reading lots of papers, trying to use my healthcare interventions, which someone mentioned on Reddit, they be tested to see whether it worked or didn't. And I eventually got to the bottom of what was wrong, largely being guided through a really talented doctor. And I realized that there are some doctors out there who are really, really damn good, but there's a big gap between that quality of care and what everyone else has. And some company has to exist to close that gap, which is a big part of what we're doing with Superpower.
I love that. And again, on the gaming side, and I don't want to get sidetracked, we've already mentioned someone who can be a bit of an inspiration in the tech space, which was Naval Ravikant. And he said something similar, that you often learn more from games or things to that effect about game theory and human behavior than any kind of book on the topic, because obviously you develop skin in the game and develop that sort of first world experience of game theory and human behavior. On the topic of healthcare, and again, diving right into it, would you mind sharing your vision for how the future of healthcare is looking? I know it's an incredibly broad question, but I'd love to hear about that vision and also how Superpower actually fits into that vision.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like healthcare today is about treating sickness, right? And I think in the future, ideally, people don't get sick. And what that means is healthcare has to detect transitions from wellness to disease early, right? And then has to intervene really, really, really early. So I think a defining characteristic of the future of healthcare is detecting early and intervening early so that we don't have what we call healthcare today, which is sick care and dealing with people when it's a little bit too late. I think there are several other interesting trends, which most people are going to disagree with, but I'll say them anyway. One is I think doctors are going to be disintermediated. I think that humans are going to interface directly with algorithms. People look at me like I'm crazy when I say this. And the catch is this is already happening, right? Like when people have a health problem, when you have a health problem, what's the first thing you do? It's probably pulling out your phone and searching Google, maybe asking ChatGPT, maybe going to HIMS. All of these are algorithms, right? People today, their first touch point, the majority of the time is Google, an algorithm, not the doctor. And this trend is going to continue. And it's going to, we're going to enter a world where these algorithms are way better than doctors because the algorithms know every little data point about you and they know every little data point about medicine. So I think that's one thing which will define where we're going. Another defining characteristic is that we're going to see healthcare transition to a tool for human performance. And if we look at sci-fi novels, healthcare isn't used to like fix a cold or flu. Healthcare is used to help someone be smarter. It's to help someone get 8 hours sleep in 4 hours. It's to help someone double or triple their lifespan. It's to help someone be more physically performant, right? These are the use cases of healthcare 10, 20, maybe 30 years from now that don't exist today. So I think healthcare as a tool for human performance is going to be a dominant trend as well. And I think the final trend is this idea of healthcare starting to look like every other industry. In every other industry, consumers are empowered, right? Consumers make choices, they make buying decisions, they kind of treat as adults. It doesn't really happen in healthcare. Just about every single thing in healthcare is gated by a prescriber. And the dogma is what has to be gated by a prescriber. Healthcare is complex, it's hard. We can't trust consumers. That's what they said with fintech, right? They used to say, well, drawing money is hard. Then they said, well, taking out a small line of credit is hard. Then they said, like, mortgages are hard. The catch is all of those things technology has now done. And technology is going to move into the even harder problems of healthcare and solve that in a way that consumers can interface with directly without the intermediary of a doctor.
I think that's such a fascinating frame because, as I said, if you said to me even a year and a half ago that, right, the concept of not having that gatekeeper, so to speak, behind improving your health, to me that would seem so alien. But I think I mentioned before, about a year ago, I started getting a Whoop band, and this is a very rudimentary tool for sort of self-diagnosis. And God forbid any doctors listen to this, they're going to be cringing in their seats or their cars at the idea of a patient coming in saying, I think I have XYZ. But I would agree. I think as technology, as you said, is getting more adept at picking up these different biomarkers and indicators and becoming easier and easier to identify earlier and earlier, it's definitely a trend that I think is only going to speed up. I mean, even give an example, I think about a week ago, or actually about a month ago, I'm based in Bali, Indonesia. Very often I bounce between there and Ireland. And I came down with a thing called dengue fever, which can be quite serious. But that, I mean, I was getting notified 3 or 4 days before I even felt the symptoms. Heart rate variability all over the place, body temperature, all these different biomarkers. And I can definitely see a point where, as you said, you're getting notified. You take that proactive approach, as opposed to reactively trying to pick up the pieces. And I think that's very, very aligned with the trend that I see in our best clients and our best podcast guests, which is taking that holistic approach instead of this whole siloed, I think, issue realistically with healthcare, where you have different departments across. You have the cardiac department, you have everything under the sun, where there's communication is disjointed. And as I said, we're not viewing the human organism as a singular entity. And instead, the way I think things will go is everything's been brought together. And as you said, we're improving the quality of the life instead of just trying to postpone sickness. But on that topic, You talk a lot about, and again, I've read a lot of your work on your musings, primary care right now. So I want to, before we talk about the future, I'd love to hear your thoughts on where things are right now. You mentioned primary care innovation. Fundamentally, it's not something that's really working. Would you mind sharing a bit about that? And then I'd love to hear more about where you think things are going.
In the US, there's $420 billion spent every single year on primary care. And the largest startup in the space is probably One Medical, which exited for $4 billion after 15 years of being around, right? So they didn't even capture 1% of the market. That's the valuation. One Medical's revenue is even less. They captured far less than 1% of the market. That's the biggest success in the space, right? In any other industry, this is kind of crazy. Typically, an innovator comes in and they capture far more than 1% of the market. So there's this question of like, why is this the case in healthcare? Why is it that the market's so large, so few companies actually are able to create a product that's good enough to earn them the right to capture a large chunk of the market? Why is that the case? And I think at the core of it is one thing, and it's that healthcare, in its many different forms, is still a service, right? Like the healthcare innovation in the US the past decade has been defined as find the billing code arbitrage, hire doctors and other clinicians, bill the crap out of insurance. And like that's a reliable way for someone to make $100 million in revenue. And as a result, we get all of these like lowly ambitious companies arbitraging their way to $100 million in revenue with zero innovation. I think that very few companies are empowered in the US to think bigger and think about what it looks like to completely reinvent something from the ground up. And I think there are systematic incentives against that and structural incentives against that. I think the first is that it's very hard to turn healthcare into some form of a product because humans want to chat with humans and insurance won't reimburse the product. I think the second is any attempts to turn healthcare into a product result in a reduction in quality and very like straitjacketing narrow care journeys. HIMSS is an example. It's a product, but now they're like shilling drugs to everyone reasonably and indiscriminately. So I think at the core of why I said like primary care is broken, it was that there have been no companies that have been able to crack that true innovation in healthcare, whether for fault of the system or fault of their own. I don't know, probably a little bit of both. And as a result, we haven't seen like an Apple in primary care. We haven't seen like a Tesla, a company coming in and redefining the nature of what the industry looks like.
Hearing that, it really reminds me of that Henry Ford quote. If I'd asked the masses basically what they wanted, people would have gotten a faster horse, as opposed to the original automobile. So I think, as you said, improving a system where that fundamentally has its own cap, maybe not be the path forward. That being said, okay, so your premise basically is that we're pushing more towards a product-based future, more a more equal platform where people are seeing these symptoms ahead of time. Technologies playing a much, much heavier role, and as you said, it's more of a blue ocean market as opposed to trying to win this fight against commoditization, which is basically in place now because people are just trying to prevent sickness, and they're, as I said, you believe the machine itself is broken. That being said, I'd love to hear more about what that future looks like. Okay, so what do you see? I know we talk 10, 20, 30 years from now. You believe people will be sort of interfacing directly with the algorithms. Would you mind fleshing that out a bit about how you see that future looking exactly?
Yeah. So, there's this question of like, okay, assume that humans have like agents fulfilling healthcare needs for them, or algorithms fulfilling healthcare needs for them. What's actually required to make that possible? The user experience is very much, I go to system, Superpower, or something else. I ask system questions, or system proactively reaches out to me. and orders me what I need, sends things to my door, orders tests to my door, books me in for consults, books me in for some different therapies, or prescribes things for me. That's like the user experience, right? The basic user experience is at any given point in time, the system is putting healthcare in autopilot, or someone is proactively reaching out to the system, and the system's responding in the highest quality way, the same way a high-end concierge doctor might respond. The question then becomes, how do you actually facilitate this at scale? And a few assets have to exist. The system has to know every single thing about the person. Right? It has to know your personal history, your family history, all your data, your blood biomarkers, your other biomarkers, etc., your preferences, your budget. It has to know every single thing about medicine. The reality is the best medicine is not on the internet, it's not in medical textbooks. It's in the brains of really talented doctors. So you need to somehow get those doctors' brains onto paper or into code, right? And then the system needs to actually interact with endpoints in the real world. It needs to be able to prescribe. It needs to be able to order supplements. It needs to be able to book a consult. So basically where we get to is an agent which puts someone's health in autopilot. And for this agent to actually come to reality, it needs to know everything about you, know everything about medicine, and be able to interface with the real world.
That's such a fascinating paradigm shift. And again, I think it addresses a lot of these root issues that we see very commonly with the human side of things, where I mentioned before the siloed approach to healthcare that's happening today, where there's miscommunication, as I said, inevitably between these different departments. And I think, as you said, the solution really is having that centralized database that can interact directly with each other. You know, you're pulling in everything from top to bottom, allergies, genetic predispositions. The more complete the picture, the easier it is to predict, to recognize patterns. And ultimately, that is where technology such as AI, large language models, anything like that, AI at its core level is fundamentally advanced prediction. It's really good pattern recognition, fundamentally. And I think, as you said, it's a trend that's only going to compound over time, and I think it fills so many gaps in the market. How do you foresee the pushback, just in a very real pragmatic way, against the implementation of this sort of things? Because, as you said, you need to have the capacity to make prescriptions and all that sort of stuff. I can't imagine that sort of innovative strategy going, being implemented without a pushback. How would you see that playing out?
Prescriptions are already done by algorithms, and you have to have a commoditized physician on the other end getting a bit of data and like being a monkey at a keyboard. That's kind of how humans and all these companies work. So I think that even if the system doesn't have like legal prescribing abilities, it's in practice, like functionally prescribing, because the clinician is reduced to a commoditized like pigeon at a keyboard, or like monkey at a keyboard. So I think that's like the first thing I'd say there. Whether that is the right model in the case of HIMSS, no, it's not, because the reality is they're not actually taking in enough data points, or they to prescribe effectively, and they don't know necessarily enough about medicine. In other words, HIMSS is trying to put, I would say, too many people on pharmaceuticals because it's the only tool they have in their toolkit. I think if all you have is a hammer, where are you going to use the hammer? If you have 50 tools in the toolkit, you don't need to put everyone on a pharmaceutical drug. You can actually look across the stack at a lot of different interventions. So I guess that's my comment to that pushback. I think there's going to be a lot of other pushbacks. There's going to be a version of like healthcare is an art. You have no idea what you're talking about. Patients want to see doctors. The relationship's really important. I drive outcomes of members through the relationship, etc., etc. I think like all of this stuff is true today, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean it's true tomorrow. There are like countless examples in history where, yes, something's an art and then it becomes science. Yes, the relationship's important. It was important with your bank when you're taking out a loan for your house. Now it's not important, right? So I think too many people reason from the point in time we're at today. And the other thing the other thing I would add there is that, sorry, I'm just getting a call from someone.
No worries.
Let me spell it. Uh, okay. The other thing that I would add there is that oh, I lost my train of thought. What was I going to say?
People, you believe a lot of it's based on the premise that people are dependent on the human to human interaction.
So
They're saying historically that's
like,
not been the case.
Yeah, human interaction will still be important, but it's not going to be important at the level of like diagnostic reasoning and cognition. It's going to be important at an endpoint to drive behavior change, right? Like a clinician will be the endpoint, the way a drug's an endpoint, or a supplement's an endpoint, or a therapy, in-person therapy is an endpoint. Yeah, clinicians are great at driving behavior change, even if diagnostic reasoning is something which is far more of a data science problem that machines solve.
That's a very, very interesting framing. What jumps to mind to me, and I'm not trying to like my thoughts on this, there's a comparison to be here, and I'm not trying to make there's obviously incredibly different role, but what jumps to mind for me, for example, is a personal trainer. It's not fundamentally their knowledge. People don't hire personal trainers for the information. Everyone knows being a calorie deficit, high protein diet, resistance training, it's that reinforcement of behavioral change that the personal trainer fundamentally gets hired for at the end of the day. Is that sort of a semi-accurate comparison that you see? And then basically letting the algorithms actually make the decisions and the prescriptions and so on?
Yeah, I think accountability at the level of the way a personal trainer holds them accountable is important to drive outcomes. The reality is, like, given the tools at our fingertips today, we still need behavior change to drive certain outcomes. And I think humans are a really important part of a behavior change stack.
I make, again, that 100% I think is irrefutable. There's nobody that's either works as a therapist or GP or anything like that would be able to dispute that, I think. Then in terms, again, of the future, I mean, a lot of what you're talking about reminds me, and I'm sure you've read all of his books, but Yuval Noah Harari's books, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, Homo Deus, which to me is very, very reminiscent of the work that you're doing at Superpower. In terms of innovation moving forward, is there a particular type of AI or technology that, or medicine in general, that will leave the biggest impact, or do you believe it's more so the consolidation of all these different data points within people's bodies that'll make the biggest impact in the next few years?
Yeah, the reality is, like, no amount of supplements, sauna, healthy lifestyle behaviors, exercise is going to reliably help someone live past 120, right? No amount of that is going to make the 100-year-old feel like 50. The only thing that will is deep biotech. So I think the most interesting innovations are deep biotech. And what I think the implication of that is that if we can, I think deep biotech is going to be, like, very expensive as well, right? And I think in a world where deep biotech is very expensive, the implication is actually the way to live long is to be able to afford deep biotech. In other words, like, increasing ability to pay helps you live longer than exercising 5 times more and going to far more saunas, ice baths, and all of that jazz.
Interesting. I was reading it was Harvard Business Review's book on, they did a book on artificial intelligence. And again, I'm actually not even talking about artificial intelligence here. It's more so a point that they made about the economics of it. And fundamentally that when something becomes very, very often the biggest levels of innovation comes when cost of distribution or accessibility gets to, significantly drops. And I think an example they gave was in the Industrial Revolution, for example. The biggest change was the fact that all of a sudden indoor lighting, for example, the price of production absolutely nosedived, and all of a sudden people could work late. And you see that again and again in different areas, access to electricity. It wasn't more so the actual technology itself that was so innovative. It was the fact that all of a sudden everybody could afford it, and that acted as a force multiplier for the for the actual technology. Again, big question. What do you believe the drivers will be for this reduced cost or increase accessibility to the sort of biotech that you're talking about?
I don't think the constraint right now is cost. I think the constraint right now is quality and the biotech actually to this day. I think the primary constraint is time. I think that all these things take time, right? You run clinical trials, you go through this process, you wait for several underlying technologies to improve, you wait for several interpretive and analytical technologies to improve. And I think many of those things happen in concert. And my sense is the constraint to higher quality and innovations coming to light is time, insofar as that correlates with all sorts of other things. And then I think the constraint to lower cost is probably the same, insofar as time correlates to scale and capitalism, and both those forces tend to reduce costs over time.
It's a great answer. Very well thought out. Big question I have to ask as well, and this is sort of outside of the box, but it's something that I know you've mentioned before. Sleep. And I got a bit of a curveball here, but I know you said one of your goals is to be able to get people from 8 hours sleep to 4 hours. I'd love to hear more about what that actually looks like, because I know there's going to be a bit of a pushback there. What's your stance on, again, the capacity for humans to get by on lower sleep, and effectively evolving past the need for certain constraints that people would assume are immovable?
If I knew, I'd be working on it. So I don't know. And I'm optimistic because there are some people out there who sleep 4 hours a night, every single night, and they perform fine. They live as long as everyone else does. They age at the same rate. And I think given that some people's biology is geared for that to work, presumably there are generalizable insights from what's ever happening in their biology. I think there's also a world where we can compress, if we can increase the percent of time in REM sleep and deep sleep, the increased efficiency allows us to sleep less. I think my problem with that theory is that light sleep also matters, right? So if I had an answer, I'd be working on it. But I think that often with these things, the answer is to start with the mission and the vision, and then to work backwards from it. People have explored the space. So a company called Dream showed they were able to increase quality of sleep and depth of sleep and percent of time in deep sleep. Whether that translates to actually being able to sleep less is more equivocal. But I think that I think that this is a far-fetched but potential therapeutic modality, which is equivalent to increasing lifespan. Because if someone sleeps 4 hours a night instead of 8, they get 4 hours back times 365 days a year times 100 years of life, which is a lot of time.
Yeah, makes sense. If you break down the percentage of the day, you're literally adding on years. Now, it's not one that I want to be the guinea pig of. I'm very often involuntarily the guinea pig for it, but I'm definitely not reaping the benefits on 4 hours sleep. I'm sure you're maybe the same at times.
Yeah, man. 4 hours sleep is something I cannot do. I'm definitely I don't know. I think over time I've learned to sleep less than I used to, and I think a big part of that is being efficient at sleeping, and then also psychologically being okay to get a little bit less sleep. But I'm still a average of 7 hours person.
That's fair enough. And I actually would love to hear your thoughts on kind of what you're personally doing on the, I hate the term biohacking, but on the biohacking front, because I feel like you might have some ideas on that one. But rolling back to the startup side of things, obviously you do a lot of investing. You've a VC back. Again, we mentioned this. You're very, very much the opinion of thinking big, which I think is very, very admirable. In your experience, where do you think a lot of people make mistakes when starting healthcare businesses, such as what you're doing with Superpower? Is it the case of thinking too small, thinking too big? You know, what are some lessons when starting these sort of businesses that you wish you knew when you're getting into the space?
I think that a lot of people are psyched out of good ideas by so-called experts. I think that a lot of people end up getting forced to use too much logic and they lose sight of the soul or emotion behind the company. I think that too many, I think there are a lot of people who can like dream small and optimize revenue. Then there are a lot of people who can like dream big and have a crazy vision. And I think that the marriage of the two is the sweet spot. I think the massive dreamers have to work out how to get the incremental dollar of revenue, and the revenue optimizers have to realize how they can be a bigger vision. Yeah. I think typically people dream too small. I think like if you put hot air in a chamber, it swells to fill the size of the chamber. I think that's like we're hot air, right? The size of the chamber is the size of our ambition. So I think increasing the size of our ambition increases the size to which we can swell and what is possible of us, from us. So I think that people do tend to dream too small. It's hard to dream big because like there's going to be people listening to this podcast who are like, look at this dude kind of saying all this stupid stuff. He doesn't understand healthcare. He's wrong. He's too ambitious. What's wrong with him? He's naive, overly optimistic. There's so many of those people, and they're probably listening to me saying this right now, and they've been thinking it the whole time. And we have to fight against them because they're not the people who actually innovate, right? And I think that it's really easy to be the person crying wolf from the sidelines or criticizing from the sidelines. It's far harder to be the person who has to like deal with that and just like ignore it and tune it out in favor of actually trying to change things.
I'm getting some serious Steve Jobs vibes. And again, this is nothing but the biggest compliment. I think several things that you've said so far in the podcast. Number one, I think you mentioned sort of beginning with the ending in mind. It reminds me, it's very reminiscent of a talk that Steve Jobs was giving back in the day when somebody said, why do you build the iPhone on a specific programming language? And, XYZ would be significantly faster. And he paused and said, what I have found is that we must basically begin with the end goal and work backwards to the technology, because we find that when you go the other way around, it never works. As you said, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You start trying to put a pretty square object into a circular hole. And then obviously there's a parallel with, his big speech, here's to the dreamers, here's to the crazy ones. They're the ones that actually make the difference. What I find incredibly admirable, and again, I'm on the exact same page with regards to, again, something Naval Ravikant has said, very often the workload required to do something audacious is the exact same as the workload required to do something small in whatever capacity you want. The restaurant owner isn't working probably any less harder than half of the people in Silicon Valley. Well, maybe extreme comparison there, but this mindset that you have, the audacity, and I mean that in nothing but a positive, admirable trait, is that something that you've always had? What has made you think that you can make these fundamental changes to industries? Where does that come from?
It's interesting. I think Steve Jobs has an interesting quote about this, where one of the most powerful things is realizing that everything around you, everything in the world is created by people just like you. And when you realize that, you realize you can change things, right? And I think part of it is actually realizing that and seeing that most things around you are made by people just like you who just dream a little bit bigger. So I think that is something which I have really internalized. I also think that it's not easy. Right? Like there are days when I'm questioning myself. There are days where I'm like, fuck, this is really hard, or I'm jaded. And I think that one way to fight against jadedness is to reset expectations. I think if there's this idea from Jeff Bezos' shareholder letter about learning how to do a handstand. And he says, if you tell someone that you're going to be able to do a handstand in a month, a walking handstand, and they get a month in and they can't do it, they're like, fuck, I'm a failure, I give up. If you tell someone it's going to take you a year to do a walking 50%, and then a month in, they can kind of do it. They're like, hell yeah, I'm making progress. The decision to pursue something versus give up is purely a function of the expectation. Purely a function of the expectation. And what that means is like ambition and motivation are a function of expectations. And I think if the expectation is, well, by the age of 28, you're like, build a $1 billion company, they impact this many people, blah, blah, blah. Well, you're going to get to 28, you're not going to have done that. You're like, okay, I'm a failure, I can't dream big anymore, this is too hard. The alternative is interesting though. What if your expectation is, I'm going to have done that by the time I'm 100? Well, that means when you're 45, if you haven't done it yet, keep going. When you're 55, if you haven't done it yet, you keep going. Now, there comes a point when maybe it gets to you. But I think it's surprising. Like, there's this idea of ambition decreasing with age. And I think a surprising reason, a surprisingly common reason for that is expectations, right? It's like people have the expectation that they're going to do crazy things by 30. They don't, and therefore they give up. And I think just by resetting expectations, we can change the scope of ambition and motivation.
I think it's a lot of the case of that whole Bill Gates quote of, you overestimate what you can do in a year. You can underestimate what you can do in 10 very often. And I'm going to quote a study and I'm going to butcher it, but it's been one that's been doing the rounds of podcasts a lot recently. But you probably heard of this one. Again, could have been Harvard. The story of the two mice, the drowning, that were left in water. So they basically had this study where they got two mice. It's a bit of a morbid study, but it's very, very insightful and completely correlates to what you're saying here, where basically put a certain set of mice into water. They drowned after like a minute, right? Dark. But then they basically had a nut, and the idea here was sort of what was their will like? What was their faith? What was their capacity to keep going? But what they did then was they got a second batch of mice, and around 55 seconds in, they took them out of the water, let them rest, and then they put them back in. The second batch of mice, when they went back into the water, they were able to survive in the water for over half an hour because they actually believed it was possible. They'd gotten some sort of feedback mechanism where they're like, okay, to keep metaphorically fighting forward. And I think, as you said, that when you extend there's this whole thing of, be impatient with the inputs, but patient with the outputs. I think when you extend the horizon for your grand vision, be it big or be it small, inevitably you allow yourself, you allow the results to compound. As Naval says, the best things in life compound. And as you said, time is very, very often the biggest factor. So I think it's a really, really good frame if you want to do something big.
Man, I love that. I'm going to be quoting that a lot. Thank you for sharing.
I was talking to this Irish guy. Dude, before I mean, maybe double check the numbers, but I think it gives a lot of insights. Rolling back into your own journey, I think there's a lot of people that are going to be do their due diligence and they're going to be looking at this sort of work that you're doing. That Steve Jobs quote, I think for me is very, very similar. Then moving, I know you live in the US now, obviously, Australia based originally. You're probably rubbing shoulders with people that are doing these big things, and you realize, oh, these people are not smarter than me. They're just thinking bigger. If someone was to try and follow your path, not necessarily word for word, but the idea of trying to do something big, what kind of roadmap would you prescribe to them? What I'm really getting at is, what kind of place have mentors and such played in your own development in starting the businesses that you have? And was there sort of a blueprint that you followed to get where you are today?
I think people should maximize exposure, and that means apprenticing for someone, moving to a new city, moving to San Francisco, meeting as many people as possible. Go to where you can maximize exposure. And I think if the only thing you try to do is at any given point in time say, what is the thing right now which maximizes exposure, and just do that, people will set themselves up quite well for doing the things you're talking about doing. So I'll leave it at that, because I think anything else I say will taint the importance of maximizing exposure.
Completely agree. But again, completely agree. Exposure is one thing, 100%. Completely agree. As in, I'm from the west of Ireland, rural part, exposure to I mean, it is a medical device capital, Galway, where I'm from, but that's beside the point. Exposure 100%, but say you do get exposed to people that, you know, are making these decisions and all that kind of thing. When you are starting off in a new industry, for example, like you were at some point, what sort of value exchange do you believe you're able to provide to get that mentoring or what have you? You know, everybody when they're in a new industry or a new paradigm within an industry, there's obviously that you know, argument that you're either rich in time or you're rich in money. How would you go about finding those mentors within that industry? Again, I completely agree. Exposure, very, very important, but it gets to a point where these people that you're being exposed to need to make a trade-off.
To achieve great things. Like, I think that,
Okay.
I think that's a false assumption. I think that we shouldn't be, like, we should only be optimizing for mentors that optimizes for exposure. I think there comes a time when there are a lot of fake work, or artificial complexity, and that can look like a version of things where it's like, well, I can't do X unless I have 5 mentors, or before I send these 10 cold emails, I need to do A, B, C, D, E, right? And I just think that the reality is a combination of like maximize action, minimize fear, maximize risk taking, maximize exposure, maximize failures, like screw ups. I think like that is what's upstream of doing great things versus thinking about the perfect set of facts to create a perfect scenario which acts as a perfect foundation to launch something.
It's a great counterpoint. On that point there, so assuming that you kind of have this whole do-it-yourself attitude, which is great. And I know, for example, when a few years back, I was like, right, I'm going to learn how to program, I'm going to become a developer. And I was stuck in sort of the technical equivalent of what you're talking about, which was, it was called tutorial purgatory. You're like, right, one more course, one more lesson, one more theoretical, proof that I know my stuff is required before I actually take it to market or try and implement. Is there what kind of skill stack do you believe is most important in the upcoming years? You know, in your personal opinion, what sort of skill set has served you the best in getting where you are today? You'll be soft skills, quote unquote, hard skills, or what have you.
Yeah, I think throughout history, the narrative has been that every revolution, technical skills become more important, right? Like there was this narrative, we're the industrial evolution, therefore you need to be the technological industrialist. Then we moved to the hardware evolution, and the world of like PCs, chips, and the narrative was, well, you need to be the technologist. And then we moved to the software and the internet and the web evolution, and the narrative was, well, now you really need to be a technologist because the marginal cost is zero. People who are technologists can reach the whole world. And in each of those revolutions, the reality is that the technologists lost out to the salespeople, to the wordsmiths, to the strategic thinkers. Now we're in the AI revolution, and the narrative in the AI revolution is you need to be the technologist, right? And I think that there's this fetishization of technology, and I think that being a technologist is helpful insofar as it helps someone understand the constraints of what's possible. It helps someone understand the levers that can be pulled. It helps someone be a better salesperson, right? Elon's a better salesperson because people think he's like hyper-technical. Sam Altman's a better salesperson because people think he's hyper-technical. The reality is they're salespeople, and they're strategists, and they're capital allocators, and they're storytellers, and they're narrative builders. The reality is like the world is still ran by the people with soft skills versus the people with hard skills. And anytime someone tells me that this time it's different, I tend to point to history.
Interesting. So learn to build, learn to sell. If you can do both, you'll be unstoppable. But your stance is, I mean, again, Steve Jobs, perfect example of it. For anyone listening, basically Steve Jobs, obviously when starting Apple, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak. And I'm reminded that the Steve Jobs movie, I think it was the one with Michael Fassbender, where there's this famous scene, I've watched it way too many times, where Steve Wozniak, the technical member, played by Seth Rogen in the movie, gets to a point where he just turns to Steve Jobs and says, "What do you do?" And Steve Jobs says, what do you mean? He's like, "Well, every day I get told Steve Jobs is a genius." He's like, "But you can't code." He's like, "You can barely design. Like, what do you actually do?" And Steve Jobs says, and they're at the time in the movie, they're in an orchestra hall. He said, "You, the producer, the technical person, the hard skills, you play the violin, you play the cello. I'm the conductor. My job is you're very good at playing the cello. My goal is to make sure that you're playing the cello, and I've engineered the entire organism basically together." So my follow-up question would be, again, I really like where you're going with this, because you said that as the barrier to entry reduces further and further for the making or the producing or the hard skills, I'm going to butcher a quote that you said, but was it that the kingdom that's easiest is hardest to maintain, or the kingdom that's easiest to conquer is hardest to maintain, but the kingdom that's hardest to conquer is easiest to maintain. There's a parallel with something Tim Ferriss said, that was the fishing is best for the fewest go. An extension of what you're saying, what I'm taking here is, as the metaphorical kingdom of hard skills becomes easier, what is the remaining constraint? That's soft skills. So what I'm hearing is, learn to build, learn to sell. If you can do both, you'll be unstoppable. What I'm hearing is Sam Altman or people of that effect, they're fundamentally selling, but behind a veneer of being technical. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, again, I'm not saying being technical isn't helpful. I think it's immensely helpful, right? I'm just saying that, if we are going to predict outcomes around, outcomes around the primary function of the people who end up building great companies, their primary function is going to be a soft skill function versus a hard skill function. Now, sometimes having an underlying technical foundation allows that softer skill function to be far more leveraged. And this is the idea of the Sam and Elon narratives of being technical, allowing them to fundraise more effectively, attract talent more effectively, strategize more effectively, etc. So I think that we will continue to see that, and I think that, so I think we will continue to see that.
And in terms, again, I'm on the same page there. With regards to the actual skills themselves, say if it's ever the case that you need to immerse yourself with a new skill set, what does your own process look like for stacking skills whenever you see that they're required? What does your learning framework look like?
I think that it depends on the nature of the skill. I increasingly over time bias to learning by doing, because I actually think that a lot of the playbooks aren't necessarily correct. I'm increasingly biased towards learning by doing, and then learning by listening to someone who has done, right? Not someone who has taught about doing or written about doing, someone who has actually done. So I find they're the two most efficient and most accurate ways to become good at something. Learn by doing, and then learn by listening to someone who's done, and chatting with someone who's done.
And it's very, very reminiscent of Nassim Taleb's whole idea about skin in the game, and just not learning from effectively keyboard warriors who know the theory, but you don't take fitness advice from the overweight personal trainer. What skill sets do you believe have stood to you the most in your own success, that have allowed to give you, has it been a mindset, has it been soft skills, have it been specific hard skills that have given you the advantage that have brought you to where you are today and the trajectory that you're heading towards?
I think the skill model of the world is probably slightly less accurate than the action model of the world, where the action model of the world says you are where you are today because you took a lot of risky actions, versus the skill model of the world which says you are where you are today because you built up a lot of skills. And that said, I think I built a lot of foundational skills, the level of reasoning and thinking. I spent a lot of time understanding the fundamental frameworks that allow for effective thinking, and then trying to hone those frameworks by observing them in the real world, and then coming up with my own frameworks by being really analytical about seeing how the world works. I think those foundational frameworks allow better reasoning, and I think better reasoning is a really, really high leverage skill. If I was to look at other things which I think have been useful, or some of the foundational frameworks I think are useful, I think understanding foundational statistics and probability is very useful. I think understanding foundational psychology is immensely useful. I think understanding foundational microeconomics at the level of supply and demand curves and utility and marginal utility and all those microeconomic functions is very useful. I think understanding basic finance is useful. And I think being able to think through a business through the lens of finance and financials and income statement and balance sheet is a skill which adds another flavor to thinking about business. I think understanding the foundations of design are very helpful as well, because you're able to think through how brains process information and what makes something visually appealing and functional versus the opposite.
And then through the lens of those skills, or maybe other ones you think are important, what are some non-negotiable must reads that you think have gotten you to where you are today, and that people that maybe should look at reading?
So the Nassim books you mentioned are definitely worth it. Charlie Munger's or Charlie's Almanac is definitely worth it. They're the ones which immediately come to mind. I think the fiction book Dune, read through the lens of understanding human behavior and politics and social systems, are a really, really powerful book. And then the classics, right? So like your Thinking Fast and Slow, the Slows of the world, I would also put up there for understanding elementary psychology. At the level of finance, I think it's easier to take online courses or just work in a financial firm versus reading books. At the level of microeconomics, I think textbooks can be quite helpful, but again, courses, microeconomics are potentially a little bit more helpful. At the level of design, I think courses can also go a long way there, as can books.
It's a great answer, and it also gives a bit of an insight to your outlook on the healthcare system, because I'm assuming there's a bit of comparison between, was it Paul but the main character in Dune, Adrakis? What, I can't think of the Messiah from Dune. I suppose I'm assuming there's a bit of a parallel between people assuming that healthcare it's interesting seeing a comparison there between the Dune and the healthcare side of things. It's a lens I'm gonna have to definitely go back down and there's something abstract there.
Yeah, no, potentially. I think that everything we consume impacts us in one way, shape, or form. I guess like the thing that will be interesting to you is you've consumed a lot of foundational information. I think the question now is like, how does that fit into your model of the world, right? And I think that's like Naval. Don't get me wrong, everything he's saying is in a way someone else's. He's consumed a lot of foundational information, then he's observed the world and added his own wrapper on it. And I think that's more powerful because once we create our own concepts on top of existing concepts, they hold more meaning and more utility for us. So I think an interesting thing for you is going to be, okay, cool, you've got these foundational concepts. How do they turn into your own frameworks? And ironically, I think that comes from reading less versus reading more, consuming less versus consuming more, and instead focusing on like observing and being in the world and like the whole idea of like reasoning up from first principles versus just by the analogy of what someone else has mentioned.
I love it. Yeah, mutating different ideas together and actually implementing, then seeing the real world application of them all. I think again, there's there's a lot on a personal level I'll definitely need to look further into, but that's a really, really good insight. I appreciate it. Max, I also want to be respectful of your time, because I know we've been going on for an hour now, but I suppose lastly, for anyone maybe that's looking to do something great in healthcare, that they're looking at your work, they're looking at similar people. What is one bit of advice that you would give to them in terms of just make sure they absolutely smash the next decade to, if they're living to 120 on 4 hours sleep, and trying to, expand human lifespan and health span. What's that one bit of advice you give to anyone that's on a similar journey to yourself?
Consumers are probably better at predicting the future than doctors. And a lot of people are going to tell someone with a passion and belief about something why it's wrong. And I think that person is right as often. The founder is right as often as they are wrong. So I think founders should, for the most part, ignore expert advice, stick to their convictions, take beliefs, have aesthetic visions for the future, balance logic and emotion, and create what they think is like the thing that should exist in the world. Because if there's a foundational reason why it should exist, eventually it will exist.
I love it. Max, where can people find you and find out more about what you do?
They can message me on LinkedIn. I reply to all messages. If I don't, just follow me up. It's because I missed it. They can also do the same on Twitter, or email me at max@superpower.com.
And check out his website. He's got some good writings. Appreciate it, Max.
Awesome chatting, Thomas.
Thanks, Matt.